They didn't wake him because he was a hero. They woke him because they were desperate, and the historical record said his kind were incredibly ruthlessly violent. When the frost finally cracked, the first thing he felt wasn't a noble urge to save the galaxy. It was a migraine that felt like a rusty nail being driven through his frontal lobe. They thought they unthawed a savior. What they got was a relic from a bloody forgotten era who just wanted a damn cigarette. The first sense to return wasn't sight or sound. It was smell. It was the sharp chemical sting of ozone mixed with the distinct stomach-churning odor of old copper and bleached protein. Caleb tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was coated in ground glass. He couldn't move his tongue. It was swollen, glued to the roof of a mouth that tasted like pennies and stale bile. Then came the cold. Not a surface chill, but a deep, bone-aching absolute zero that felt like it had hollowed out the marrow in his femurs and replaced it with liquid nitrogen. He tried to open his eyes. The lids were crusted shut with a thick, viscous gel that had hardened over an eternity. When he finally forced them apart, the light was a physical assault, brilliant, sterile, and violently white. He squeezed them shut again, letting out a sound that was supposed to be a groan, but emerged as a wet, pathetic rattle. Heart rate stabilizing, synaptic pathways reconnecting, though the neural friction is alarmingly high. The voice wasn't speaking English, not really. It was a rhythmic series of clicks and soft, reedy whistles that Caleb's brain somehow translated into words, dragging behind the sound by a half-second. It gave him an instant wave of vertigo. He didn't rise heroically from his pod. He rolled to the side blindly, grasping the edge of a slick metallic slab, and violently threw up a stream of translucent, foul-smelling, amniotic fluid. It splattered against a floor that felt entirely too clean. "Fascinating," a second voice hummed. "The purging mechanism is entirely mechanical. No chemical synthesis, just raw muscular contraction." Caleb gasped for air. The atmosphere in the room was thin, too crisp, lacking the heavy, polluted humidity he was used to. It burned his lungs. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand, blinking away the tears of sheer physical agony. His joints popped in rapid, terrifying succession, like dry branches, snapping in a quiet forest as he forced his knees under him. When his vision finally stopped swimming, he saw them. There were 3 of them standing on the other side of a transparent barrier. They were humanoid in the loosest sense of the word. Tall, maybe pushing 7 feet, but impossibly spindly. Their limbs looked like pale birch branches, wrapped in grey, translucent skin. Beneath that skin, Caleb could see the faint pulse of bioluminescent fluid tracking through their veins. They had no noses, just vertical slits above wide, lipless mouths, and eyes that were completely black, like polished obsidian stones. They were looking at him the way a biologist looks at a particularly dangerous, unpredictable insect trapped in a jar. "Where?" Caleb started his voice, a gravelly whisper. He coughed, spitting a glob of phlegm onto the pristine floor. He didn't care about the mess. "Where's my squad?" The 3 beings exchanged a look. It wasn't a subtle shift. Their entire posture rippled with unease, their long fingers twitching. "Your squad," the tallest one said. Its translated voice carried the synthetic cadence of a weary academic. "You refer to your localized military unit. I am Aris. This is Commander Tolan. You are the only specimen we could successfully resuscitate. The others suffered catastrophic cellular degradation. You have been in stasis for approximately 11,000 of your standard solar cycles." Caleb just stared at Aris. 11,000 years. A normal man, a stable man, might have dropped to his knees. He might have screamed, wept for his lost family, his friends, his ruined Earth. Caleb didn't do any of that. The number was too big. It was a statistical anomaly, not a tragedy. It meant nothing to his pounding head and his freezing skin. His brain simply refused to process it, locking the existential horror behind a thick, defensive wall of immediate physical needs. "I need pants," Caleb rasped, looking down at his naked, shivering torso. He was covered in a network of pale scars, the remnants of shrapnel and close-quarters combat from a war that apparently nobody remembered. And water. "If you don't give me water right now, I'm going to break that glass and drink whatever is glowing inside your neck." Commander Tolan took a step back. The translation matrix didn't need to filter the very real, very human violence in Caleb's eyes. "Dispense hydration," Tolan ordered, tapping a console on his wrist. "And clothing. Quickly. Its aggression protocols are already active." Caleb sank back onto the edge of the thawing slab, his heavy muscles twitching with phantom tremors. He wasn't a hero. He was a grunt, a blunt instrument from a dead world. And judging by the absolute terror radiating from his rescuers, they needed something broken. The clothing they provided was a joke. It was a seamless charcoal grey fabric that felt like woven spider silk. It stretched to accommodate his broad shoulders and thick thighs, but it offered zero thermal protection. Caleb sat on a minimalist floating chair in an interrogation room that lacked corners. Everything was curved, sterile, and aggressively white. He drank from a metallic cylinder, gulping down water that tasted entirely too pure. It lacked the reassuring metallic tang of the recycled water from his barracks. Aris and Tolan stood on the opposite side of a curved table. They didn't sit. Caleb got the impression their brittle-looking physiology wasn't designed to fold into chairs. "You are smaller than the historical models predicted," Tolan noted, his obsidian eyes scanning a holographic projection of Caleb's vitals. "Yet your mass is concerning. Your bone density is nearly 4 times that of a standard galactic citizen. Your gravity must have been punishing. Earth was a rock," Caleb muttered, crushing the empty water cylinder in his hand. The metal crumpled with a sharp crunch that made both aliens flinch. Caleb looked at the crushed tin, then at the aliens. He wasn't even trying. The metal was just incredibly flimsy. Or he was just that much denser. "You didn't wake me up to talk about gravity," Caleb said, tossing the crumpled cylinder onto the table. It slid to a stop near Tolan's spindly fingers. "You said I'm the only one who survived the thaw. You spent resources on me. You gave me magic, stretchy pants." "Why?" Tolan bristled, his grey skin flushed with a faint, angry violet hue beneath the surface. "You lack the deference expected of a rescued primitive, and you lack the muscle mass to make me care." Caleb shot back. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. "I've been a soldier my whole life. I know a requisition order when I see one. You didn't save me. You issued me. Who are we fighting?" Aris intervened, stepping in front of the commander. "We are the coalition of Vespera. For 3 centuries we have maintained peace across the Orion Spur. We are architects, philosophers, genetic artists." "You sound soft," Caleb interrupted. "We evolved past the need for physical confrontation," Aris corrected, though there was a tremor in the translation. "Our conflicts were resolved through algorithmic debate and economic pressure. Until the Scourge. The Scourge," Caleb deadpanned. "Original. They do not debate," Tolan snapped. "They are an aggressive, parasitic, expansionist species. They board our vessels. They ignore our energy shields because they use solid kinetic weaponry, a barbaric technology we abandoned millennia ago. When they board, they slaughter. Our security forces are designed for crowd control and pacification. They use non-lethal sonic disruptors." Caleb rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a secondary headache forming right behind his eyes. "Let me get this straight. You guys are getting beaten to death by space pirates because your guns only play loud music. It is highly concentrated sonic resonance," Tolan defended. But yes, the Scourge wear dampening armor. They are physically overpowering. They tear our security personnel apart with their bare hands. We searched the ancient archives for a solution, a species capable of matching their brutality. "And you found us," Caleb said. A cynical, bitter laugh escaped his throat. It sounded like grinding stones. "Humanity, the galaxy's designated attack dogs. You are survivors," Aris said softly. "Your history is a continuous ledger of brutal, relentless warfare. You adapted to kill your own kind over imaginary lines in the dirt. We require that ruthlessness." Caleb stared at the floor. The absurdity of it all was a heavy weight on his chest. He had died or gone into the ice, which was basically the same thing fighting a war over a dwindling freshwater supply in the ruins of North America. Now he was sitting in a sterile spaceship, being asked to commit murder for a species of brittle pacifists who viewed him as a slightly more advanced version of a club. He felt a deep, profound exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He wanted to tell them to go to hell. He wanted to lay back down on the freezing slab and let his heart stop. But then the sensory details of the room shifted. The low, omnipresent hum of the ship's engines suddenly pitched down. The pristine white lighting flickered, turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The air pressure dropped, popping Caleb's ears, and the unmistakable metallic thud of something heavy locking onto the ship's hull reverberated through the floorboards. Tolan's violet flush drained instantly, leaving him a stark, terrified ash-grey. "Hull breach," Tolan whispered, his voice stripped of all previous arrogance. "Medical Sector 4. They are here." The Scourge. Caleb didn't feel a surge of adrenaline. He didn't feel heroic. He felt a deep, irritating resignation. He stood up slowly, feeling his dense muscles stretch his joints, aching with a dull, persistent throb. He looked at the two terrified aliens. "Where's the armory?" Caleb asked. "We don't have one on this deck," Aris panicked, backing into a corner. "Only the surgical tools." Caleb sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath. "Of course you don't." The corridor outside the interrogation room was a scene of clinical chaos. Emergency lights pulsed in a nauseating strobe effect, casting jagged shadows across the curved, seamless walls. The air already smelled different. The sterile ozone was being rapidly replaced by the stench of burning polymers and something organic, rancid and wet. Caleb stepped out, barefoot. The floor was cold. Tolan and Aris cowered behind him, their long limbs folded in defensive postures that wouldn't stop a stiff breeze, let alone a bullet. "How many?" Caleb asked, keeping his voice low, guttural. "Usually a boarding party consists of 5 to 8 drones." Tolan stammered, pointing a trembling finger down the long, yellow-lit hallway. "They are heavily armored. They will not negotiate." "Good, saves time." Caleb walked over to a structural support column near the doorframe. A thick, metallic conduit ran along the exterior, pumping some kind of blue coolant. It was as thick as his wrist and looked like solid iron. He didn't have time to ask what it was. He gripped it with both hands, planted his bare feet against the wall for leverage, and pulled. The metal groaned. Caleb's biceps bulged, the scar tissue on his shoulders stretching taut. He felt a sharp tweak in his lower back, a painful reminder that he was 35 years old and fresh out of an 11 millennia nap. But the conduit snapped. Coolant hissed, spraying into the air and misting his face with an icy chemical fog. He hefted the broken pipe. It was jagged at the end, heavy, and perfectly balanced for swinging. It felt like home. A horrific screech echoed from down the hall. It sounded like metal grinding on bone. They came around the corner a moment later. 3 of them. The Scourge. They weren't elegant. They looked like walking slabs of muscle and chitin, roughly the size of silverback gorillas walking on 2 thick digitigrade legs. Their armor was a crude, rusted amalgamation of scavenged metal plates bolted directly into their flesh. They held heavy, blocky firearms that smelled strongly of crude propellant. When they saw Caleb, they didn't pause. They didn't assess. The lead drone raised its weapon. Caleb didn't duck behind cover. The physics of the situation broke down in a fraction of a second in his mind. The weapon was large, unwieldy. The corridor was narrow. If he backed away, he gave them the angle. So he stepped forward. The drone fired. The sound was deafening, a concussive blast that ruptured the air pressure. A slug the size of a golf ball tore through the space where Caleb's head had been a millisecond prior, shattering the wall behind him and sending a shower of synthetic debris raining down on Tolan and Oris. But Caleb was already moving. He was heavy, but on this ship against these lumbering beasts, he moved with the brutal kinetic efficiency of a falling safe. He closed the distance before the drone could rack its weapon for a second shot. Caleb swung the jagged coolant pipe like a baseball bat. He didn't aim for the heavy chest plating. He aimed for the joint where the thick armored neck met the shoulder. Crack. The sound of the impact was sickening. The heavy conduit bit deep into the alien's flesh, shattering bone and whatever passed for a collarbone. Dark, viscous blood, smelling strongly of ammonia and rotting fish, sprayed across Caleb's chest and face. The drone roared, dropping its weapon and wildly swinging a massive clawed hand at Caleb's head. Caleb ate the hit. The backhand clipped his jaw. It felt like being hit by a cinder block. Stars exploded in his peripheral vision, and he tasted fresh copper in his mouth. But his neck muscles, dense and thick from a lifetime of gravity and violence, held firm. He didn't go down. He spat blood, pivoted on his heel, and drove the jagged end of the pipe directly into the center of the drone's face. It sank in with a wet crunch. The creature seized, spasmed, and collapsed its massive weight, hitting the deck with a thud that vibrated up through Caleb's bare feet. The other two drones stopped. For the first time, perhaps, in their entire campaign against the Vespera coalition, they encountered something that didn't use a sonic disruptor, and didn't die easily. They looked at the bleeding, panting human, standing over their dead kin, holding a makeshift club, dripping with alien blood. Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing the blood across his cheek. His jaw was throbbing, his back was screaming in protest, and his cryo hangover was reaching its peak. He was miserable. Well, Caleb barked, his voice echoing down the corridor. He tightened his grip on the pipe, his knuckles turning white. Who's next? The two remaining Scourge drones didn't retreat. If they possessed a biological mechanism for fear, it had been bred out of them centuries ago. Instead, they adapted. The one on the left dropped its heavy firearm, reaching behind its broad, armored back to unsheath a weapon that looked like a rusted, oversized meat cleaver. The one on the right raised its rifle, the barrel glowing with a dull orange heat. Caleb's brain fogged by 11,000 years of chemical sleep, and a skull-splitting headache did the ugly math. He had about half a second before the corridor turned into a shooting gallery. He didn't charge, he dropped. As Caleb threw his weight entirely onto the slick, blood-coated deck, the drone on the right fired. The concussive boom sucked the air out of Caleb's lungs. A kinetic slug the size of a D-cell battery roared through the space where his chest had just been slamming into the dead drone behind him. The impact detonated the corpse's armor, showering Caleb in a hot, wet spray of ammonia-scented gore and jagged chitin. Caleb didn't stop moving. Using his momentum, he rolled violently across the floor, his bare skin squealing against the pristine white panels, right into the shins of the drone with the cleaver. He swung the jagged coolant pipe in a low, sweeping arc. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a structural one. The heavy iron smashed into the alien's kneecap. The joint gave way with a sickening, wet pop. The creature bellowed a sound like grinding gears and toppled forward. But as it fell, it swung the cleaver in a blind, desperate arc. Caleb felt a sudden icy line drawn across his left bicep. The pain didn't register immediately. The adrenaline had dammed it up. But he felt the immediate, terrifying warmth of his own blood spilling down his arm, soaking into the spider silk fabric of his shirt. He grunted a feral sound, scraping the back of his throat. He scrambled up onto his knees, dropping the heavy pipe. It was too slow for close quarters. As the crippled drone tried to push itself up, Caleb drove his right fist directly into its throat. The alien's anatomy was different, but cartilage was cartilage. He felt something crunch under his knuckles. The creature gagged, dropping the cleaver. Caleb grabbed the thick, scaled crest of the drone's head, pulled it down, and brought his own knee up into its face with everything he had. Once, twice. The bone shattered. The thrashing stopped, but he had lost track of the shooter. A heavy boot slammed into Caleb's ribs. The impact lifted his 220-pound frame entirely off the ground. He flew backward, crashing into the curved wall of the corridor. His breath left him in a violent rush. Black spots swarmed his vision. His chest felt like it had been caved in by a sledgehammer. He slumped to the floor, gasping. He tasted copper. The third drone towered over him. It racked its heavy firearm, the crude mechanical bolt, clacking loudly in the ringing silence of the hallway. The barrel leveled directly at Caleb's face. The alien's obsidian eyes were devoid of emotion. Just cold, industrial execution. Caleb couldn't breathe. He couldn't lift his arms. His left bicep was screaming a deep, burning throb that synchronized with his pounding heart. He stared up into the dark barrel of the gun. So this is it, he thought, a wave of profound exhaustion washing over him. 11,000 years in a freezer, just to get put down in a hallway by a walking crab. Storzete. A high-pitched harmonic whine suddenly filled the corridor. The drone stiffened. The massive weapon trembled in its grip. Down the hall, Commander Tolan stood with his spindly legs trembling so hard he looked like he might snap in half. In his long grey fingers he held a sleek silver device shaped like a tuning fork. He had his eyes squeezed completely shut, pointing the device blindly at the drone. It was a sonic disruptor. It wasn't lethal. It didn't even penetrate the drone's heavy armor completely. But the concentrated sound wave hit the exposed, shattered joints of the alien's neck, where Caleb had beaten its comrade. The drone shrieked, clutching its head, the heavy firearm dropping to the floor with a deafening clatter. It was all the opening Caleb needed. He didn't stand up. He couldn't. He lunged forward from his knees, grabbing the fallen meat cleaver from the floor. It weighed at least 20 pounds, the grip far too thick for human hands. But Caleb wrapped both hands around it, roaring through the blood in his mouth. He drove the rusted blade upward, burying it deep into the soft, unarmored gap under the drone's chin. The creature seized. Dark fluid poured over Caleb's hands, hot and reeking. He twisted the blade, pulling violently backward until the drone's legs gave out. The massive body collapsed onto the deck, twitching twice before going completely still. Silence rushed back into the corridor, broken only by the hiss of the broken coolant pipe and Caleb's ragged, wheezing breaths. He sat back against the wall, sliding down until he was flat on the deck. He looked at his left arm. The cut was deep, right through the muscle, bleeding sluggishly onto the floor. His ribs throbbed with a terrifying intensity. Every breath was a fresh stab of agony. Down the hall, Tolan dropped the sonic disruptor. The silver tool clattered against the floor. Aris slowly peeked out from behind the doorframe, his large black eyes wide with an expression that Caleb easily recognized. Horror. Pure, unadulterated horror. They weren't looking at the dead scourge. They were looking at Caleb. They were looking at the human sitting in a pool of alien blood, covered in gore, gasping for air with a rusted cleaver resting on his lap. "You," Tolan whispered the translation matrix, struggling to capture the tremor in his voice. "You tore them apart. With your hands." Caleb closed his eyes, resting his heavy head against the bulkhead. "Yeah," he rasped, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the pristine white floor. "Welcome to Earth, you naive sons of bitches." The pain in his arm was a dull, constant fire, but the ribs were the real problem. Caleb knew the feeling of a hairline fracture. He'd suffered enough of them during the siege of Seattle. If he breathed too deeply, it felt like a knitting needle was being driven into his lung. "Fix it," Caleb growled. He was sitting on a supply crate in what passed for a medical triage station. It was just another curved, aggressively white room. Aris stood over him, holding a device that looked like a glowing glass lozenge. The alien was shaking so badly he had dropped the device twice. The dermal regenerator is not calibrated for your cellular density," Aris stammered, stepping back when Caleb glared at him. "Your tissue is incredibly stubborn. It resists the bonding agent. I don't need it to look pretty, Aris. I need it to stop bleeding so I don't pass out." Aris swallowed a visible ripple down his long, spindly throat and pressed the glowing lozenge against the deep laceration on Caleb's bicep. The pain was immediate and blinding. It felt like someone had poured boiling acid directly into his veins. Caleb locked his jaw, the muscles in his neck cording like thick steel cables. A low, continuous groan escaped his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He watched in morbid fascination as the edges of the wound literally melted, bubbling and fusing together under the blue light of the device. It left an ugly raised welt of angry red scar tissue, but the bleeding stopped. "Ribs," Caleb ordered, pointing to his side. "I cannot repair bone structure in the field," Aris said, retreating a step. "I can only administer a localized neural blocker. It will sever the pain receptors in that quadrant of your torso." "Do it." Aris pressed a small pneumatic cylinder to Caleb's side. There was a sharp hiss, and instantly the left side of Caleb's chest went entirely numb. It was a bizarre, heavy sensation, like a block of wood had been bolted to his ribs, but the sharp, stabbing pain vanished. He took his first full breath in 10 minutes. It felt fantastic. Tolan stood by the doorway, keeping a frantic watch on the corridor. "We need to move." The Scourge boarding party was communicating with their ship. "When these drones do not report back, they will send a hunter cadre." "Let them," Caleb grunted. He stood up, testing his weight. He was battered, he was dehydrated, and he felt a deep existential fatigue pulling at his mind, but his body was functioning. He walked back out into the corridor where the 3 dead drones lay. The smell was beginning to ripen a mixture of sulfur, old copper, and rotting sea kelp. Caleb knelt next to the massive armored body of the 3rd drone and picked up its heavy firearm. It was a brutally simple piece of engineering. It weighed roughly 30 pounds. The grip was designed for a hand twice the size of his with 3 thick fingers, but there was no trigger guard, which meant Caleb could awkwardly wrap his hand around the mechanism. He checked the action. It was a magnetic rail system, powered by a heavy battery pack, slotted into the stock-firing solid tungsten slugs. Primitive. Tolan sneered from a distance, looking at the weapon with deep disgust. It relies on chemical propellants to initiate the magnetic sequence. It is loud, messy, and entirely uncivilized. Caleb checked the ammunition feed. He racked the heavy bolt. The mechanical clack-clack echoed loudly. He looked at Tolan, his eyes dead and tired. "Civilized got your people slaughtered. Messy keeps me breathing. Now where are they going?" The bridge Tolan said, his posture slumping. "The Scourge do not take prisoners. They take nav data. They want the coordinates of our core worlds. If they interface with the primary flight computer, they can bypass the Coalition's firewall. How far?" "6 decks up, across the central atrium." Caleb scavenged 2 more battery packs and a heavy bandolier of tungsten slugs from the dead drones, slinging them over his shoulder. The weight dug into his collarbone, but it felt grounding. It felt real. "All right," Caleb said, stepping over the puddle of alien blood. "You two stay behind me. If you see one of those things, you run the other way. You don't try to help me. You don't use your little tuning forks. You run." "Understood. We are not cowards, human," Tolan said, though his voice cracked slightly. "We simply abhor violence." "I don't care what you abhor," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of any Hollywood heroism. He wasn't doing this to save the galaxy. He was doing it because he was trapped on a metal tube in the vacuum of space, and if the ship died, he died. "Just stay out of my line of fire." They moved. The Vespera ship was a labyrinth of sweeping curves and soft lighting. There were no hard corners, no harsh angles. It was a vessel built by a species that hadn't known conflict in generations. Every bulkhead looked like a piece of abstract art. It made Caleb sick to his stomach. It was a monument to arrogance. To assume the universe was safe just because you decided you were done fighting was the height of stupidity. Earth had taught him that. As they ascended through the decks, using a silent anti-gravity lift, the damage became apparent. The pristine white walls were scarred by heavy kinetic impacts. Soot stained the ceiling panels. The air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of smoke, and that distinct, cloying odor of Vespera blood, which Caleb realized smelled faintly like crushed lavender and ozone. They stepped out of the lift on Deck 6. "The central atrium is ahead," Oris whispered, pointing down a wide, gently curving promenade. "It is the primary transit hub for the civilian researchers on this vessel." Caleb tightened his grip on the heavy Scourge rifle. He could hear it before he saw it. The wet, tearing sounds. The low, guttural clicks of the Scourge communicating. He crept forward, pressing his back against the curved wall, his bare feet making no sound on the synthetic deck. He reached the end of the promenade and peered around the edge into the atrium. His breath hitched just for a second. The central atrium was a massive, vaulted space spanning 3 decks. It was designed as a sprawling indoor garden. Giant luminescent trees with crystalline leaves stretched toward a massive skylight that looked out into the absolute blackness of deep space. Waterfalls cascaded down terraced white stone planters, feeding glowing flora that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was easily the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen, and it was completely defiled. Dozens of Vespera bodies littered the terraced gardens. They were draped over the glowing foliage, slumped against the white stone walls, their grey, spindly limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The water in the reflecting pools ran a heavy, luminescent violet. They hadn't stood a chance. There were no weapons among the dead. Some were clutching datapads. Some had died trying to shield smaller juvenile Vespera with their frail bodies. The Scourge hadn't just killed them. They had waded through them like a farmer taking a scythe to tall grass. Caleb felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It wasn't a noble, righteous anger. Caleb didn't believe in righteousness. He had seen too many good men die in the mud over a tank of clean water to believe in a universe that cared about right and wrong. He remembered Davis. Davis had been 19, a kid from a flooded farm in the Midwest who caught shrapnel in his throat during a night raid. Davis had looked exactly like these aliens did now, wide-eyed, utterly bewildered that the universe could be so abruptly, violently cruel. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, shaking the ghost of Davis from his head. He didn't have time for ghosts. Down in the center of the atrium, pacing near a heavy blast door that Tolan indicated led to the bridge, were 6 Scourge drones. These were different from the ones in the medical bay. They were heavily armored in thick, interlocking plates of dull black metal. Their weapons were larger, slung underneath their massive arms like rotary cannons. In the center of the group stood one that was easily 8 feet tall, a brutal monstrosity covered in jagged spikes, barking orders in a series of grinding metallic clicks. A commander. 6, Caleb whispered, pulling his head back behind cover. He looked at Tolan and Oris. The 2 aliens were staring past him, looking at the massacre in their garden. Oris was silently weeping, thick, viscous tears leaking from his black eyes. They were botanists. Aris choked out his voice, barely a whisper. Philosophers. They're casualties now, Caleb said, his voice stripped of all emotion. It was the voice of a man who had survived a dead world. Listen to me. The blast door to the bridge is closed, but that big one has a cutting torch. They're going to breach it in less than 3 minutes. Tolan dragged his eyes away from the dead. You cannot fight 6 heavy shock troops. You are injured. Your weapon is standard infantry issue. Their armor will deflect it at this range. I know, Caleb said. He looked around the promenade. His eyes locked onto the anti-gravity lift they had just used. It was powered by a heavy shielded conduit that ran the length of the shaft. He looked back at the atrium, calculating the angles, the distances the cover. He was a grunt. But surviving Earth meant you learned how to make a very big mess with very little material. Aris, Caleb said, grabbing the alien by his thin grey shoulder. That glowing water in the planters. The coolant system for the hydroponics. What's the chemical base? Aris blinked, confused. It is a highly concentrated liquid fluorocarbon. It regulates the ambient temperature of the exotic flora. Is it flammable? No, it is entirely inert. But it is kept at near freezing temperatures to prevent the roots from rotting. Perfect. Caleb looked at Tolan. The structural supports for the terraced gardens. They look like they're made of the same flimsy white plastic as the rest of this ship. It is a tensile polymer, Tolan hissed, offended even in the face of death. It can withstand atmospheric pressure changes. Can it withstand a 20-pound tungsten slug traveling at Mach 3? Caleb asked, checking the battery on his heavy rifle. Tolan went silent. The realization dawned in his obsidian eyes. You would destroy the Arboretum. I'm going to drop the ceiling on them, Caleb said flatly. He handed the heavy bandolier of extra slugs to Tolan. Hold this. Don't drop it. When I start shooting, they are going to lay down suppressive fire that will tear this hallway apart. I need you two to crawl into that maintenance grate. Caleb pointed to a small circular vent near the floor. And you do not come out until the shooting stops. What are you going to do? Aris asked, trembling. Caleb stepped out from behind the cover of the bulkhead, raising the massive, awkward scourge rifle to his shoulder. He leveled the barrel, not at the heavy shock troops in the center of the room, but at the massive white stone terraced planters suspended directly above them. I'm going to do some landscaping, Caleb muttered. He pulled the trigger. The recoil was horrendous, a brutal kick that slammed against his numbed ribs, but the heavy tungsten slug roared across the atrium. It struck the massive support strut of the highest planter. The tensile polymer shattered like glass. Thousands of gallons of near-freezing liquid fluorocarbon, along with tons of soil, crystalline leaves, and heavy white stone, groaned, tilted, and then violently collapsed downward, directly onto the heavy scourge squad below. The sound of the collapse was not a single crash. It was an apocalyptic, sustained roar that ripped through the massive atrium, vibrating the deck plates, so violently Caleb's teeth rattled in his skull. Thousands of gallons of liquid fluorocarbon hit the deck first, a tidal wave of freezing, luminescent blue fluid that instantly flash-froze the ambient moisture in the air. A thick, choking white fog exploded outward. A fraction of a second later came the heavy materials. Tons of synthetic white stone wet soil and massive crystalline tree trunks slammed down directly onto the heavy scourge shock troops. The impact cratered the floor of Deck 6. Caleb pressed his back hard against the bulkhead of the promenade, covering his head as a hurricane of icy shrapnel shattered polymer, and violent displaced air roared past his position. The temperature in the corridor plummeted instantly. The exposed skin on Caleb's chest and back went numb, then began to burn with the vicious bite of extreme cold. Down in the atrium, the grinding metallic screams of the Scourge drones were abruptly silenced, crushed beneath the weight of an entire artificial ecosystem. Then silence. It was a heavy ringing quiet, punctuated only by the hiss of freezing vapor and the steady wet dripping of the remaining fluorocarbon bleeding from the shattered ceiling. Caleb exhaled. His breath bloomed into a thick white cloud in the freezing air. His ribs, despite the localized neural blocker, throbbed with a deep, dull pressure. The blocker was wearing off, his metabolism burning through calories at an astronomical rate just to keep his core temperature up, was flushing the alien medicine from his system. He stepped out from behind the bulkhead. The central atrium was a ruined wasteland. The beautiful terraced gardens were gone. In their place was a jagged mountain of white rubble, slick with blue fluid and crushed glowing flora. The heavy blast door leading to the bridge was partially obscured by the debris, but it remained sealed. Caleb raised the heavy Scourge rifle, pressing the stock into his uninjured right shoulder, and began to carefully pick his way on the sweeping ramp toward the wreckage. His bare feet slipped on the freezing deck. The cold was a physical agony now biting into the nerve endings of his toes. He ignored it. He didn't have the luxury of feeling his feet. He reached the edge of the rubble pile. The smell was overpowering. It was the sharp chemical stench of the liquid fluorocarbon, which smelled exactly like freezing dry cleaning fluid, mixed with the raw earthy scent of crushed soil and the heavy ammonia stink of dead Scourge. 4 of the massive drones were partially visible beneath the shattered white stone. They were completely flattened, their heavy black armor crushed inward like stepped-on tin cans. Thick, dark blood pooled in the freezing fluid, rapidly turning into a slushy violet ice. A sudden violent tremor shook the center of the debris pile. Caleb didn't hesitate. He leveled the rifle and waited. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the massive Scourge commander erupted from the rubble. It was a terrifying sight. The 8-foot-tall monstrosity was missing its left arm entirely sheared off at the shoulder by a falling stone slab. Its heavy black armor was cracked, leaking a continuous stream of dark fluid. The spikes adorning its crest were shattered, but it wasn't dead, and it was looking directly at Caleb. The commander roared a sound that felt like it was tearing the air molecules apart, and raised its remaining arm. The heavy rotary cannon slung under its wrist spun up with a high-pitched whine. Caleb pulled the trigger on his rifle. The heavy tungsten slug hit the commander square in the center of its chest plate. The kinetic force staggered the massive creature, knocking it back half a step, but the dense black armor held. It didn't penetrate. Caleb racked the bolt and fired again. Another deafening crack. The slug deflected off the angled plating of the commander's shoulder, sparking violently before ricocheting into the ceiling. The rotary cannon fired. It wasn't a stream of bullets. It was a solid, continuous beam of superheated plasma that tore through the air with a horrific tearing sound. Caleb threw himself to the left, diving behind a massive, overturned slab of white stone. The plasma beam tracked his movement, chewing through the deck plating and slamming into the stone barrier. The heat was instantaneous and blinding. The stone glowed a furious molten orange, hissing as the freezing fluorocarbon boiled off its surface. The air pressure in the immediate vicinity spiked, threatening to burst Caleb's eardrums. He was pinned. Caleb checked his rifle. The crude magnetic rail was warped, glowing dull red from the rapid firing. He racked the bolt, but it seized, fused by the immense heat of its own friction. It was a dead weight. He dropped the rifle. He had no pipes, no cleavers. Just his hands, a failing neural blocker, and a body that had been frozen for 11 millennia. The plasma fire stopped. The heavy thudding footsteps of the commander approached. The creature was limping, dragging its crushed left side, but it was moving with a terrifying singular purpose. It wanted the human dead. Caleb closed his eyes. He thought of Earth. He thought of the cracked, dry lake beds of Nevada. He thought of Wyatt, his old squad mate, who used to say that the only way to beat a tank was to get so close it couldn't point its barrel at you. Caleb didn't stand up. He grabbed a handful of the wet, freezing alien soil, packing it into a dense, icy ball. The massive shadow of the commander fell over the glowing, molten stone slab. The creature peered over the top, its obsidian eyes locking onto Caleb, raising its cannon for an execution shot. Caleb threw the ball of freezing mud directly into the creature's unarmored face, hitting its primary sensory slits. The commander flinched, a completely involuntary biological reaction, swinging its massive head back. Caleb surged upward. He didn't run away. He launched his entire body weight over the molten stone, throwing himself directly at the towering monster. He hit the creature's chest like a battering ram, wrapping his arms around its thick, armored neck. The momentum carried them both backward. They crashed into the freezing rubble, rolling down the slope of crushed stone and blue fluid. The smell of the commander was nauseating like rotting meat soaked in bleach. The creature thrashed violently, its raw physical power completely dwarfing Caleb's. It threw a heavy knee into Caleb's back, right into his injured ribs. The neural blocker failed completely. White-hot, blinding agony exploded in Caleb's chest. The world went dark for a fraction of a second. His breath was forced from his lungs in a ragged, bloody spray. But his grip didn't loosen. If he let go, he was dead. The commander couldn't bring the rotary cannon to bear. Caleb was too close, clinging to its chest. The creature let out a furious series of clicks and resorted to its bare hand, wrapping its thick, three-fingered claw around Caleb's throat. The grip was iron. Caleb's airway was instantly crushed. He felt his trachea groaning under the pressure. The edges of his vision began to blur, filling with dark, swarming static. Caleb reached down blindly with his right hand, his fingers scraping frantically against the slick, freezing rubble. His hand closed around a jagged shard of the shattered tensile polymer, a piece of the planter box sharp as broken glass, and roughly the size of a combat knife. He didn't aim for the armor. He drove the polymer shard upward, burying it to the hilt into the soft, unarmored joint of the commander's armpit, right where the massive limb connected to the torso. The alien shrieked. It was a high, reedy sound of pure, unadulterated pain. The grip on Caleb's throat loosened just enough for him to drag in a desperate, ragged gasp of freezing air. Caleb didn't stop. He pulled the shard out slick with thick, dark blood and drove it in again. And again. He was operating on pure animalistic survival instinct, his body a machine designed only to inflict maximum structural damage. He felt the heavy muscles in the alien's shoulder tear. He felt the thick cartilage pop under the impact of the makeshift blade. The commander thrashed wildly, throwing Caleb off. Caleb hit the icy deck hard, sliding several feet through the slush. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, gasping for air, spitting a thick glob of blood onto the white floor. The commander was on its knees, clutching its ruined shoulder. Dark blood was pouring from the wound, mixing with the blue fluorocarbon. The creature tried to raise its rotary cannon one last time, its obsidian eyes fixed on Caleb with a cold, mechanical hatred. Caleb looked around. He saw the heavy block of white stone that had severed the commander's left arm lying a few feet away. It was easily 100 pounds. He forced himself to his feet. His legs were shaking violently, his knees threatening to buckle under his own dense weight. He staggered over to the stone block, ignoring the agonizing fire in his ribs. He bent down, digging his bloodied fingers under the heavy rock. The muscles in his back screamed. The tendons in his neck corded tightly. With a guttural, terrifying roar that echoed through the ruined atrium, Caleb hoisted the massive stone block to his waist, then his chest. He took 2 heavy, staggering steps forward. The commander looked up its rotary cannon, whining as it struggled to lock onto the target. Caleb brought the heavy stone block down, with everything he had left, directly onto the center of the alien's cracked helmet. The sound was a wet, hollow crunch that made Caleb's stomach churn. The heavy black armor caved in completely. The massive creature went entirely rigid for a single terrifying second, and then collapsed sideways, landing with a heavy final splash in the freezing fluid. Caleb stood over the corpse, his chest heaving violently, his hands slick with gore. The air was dead quiet again. He slowly lowered himself to the deck, sitting in the freezing slush, resting his heavy, throbbing head in his hands. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts. His left arm was numb. His ribs felt like shattered glass. He had survived. But the cost was steep, and the bill was coming due. Human, the voice was tiny, trembling, barely carrying over the hiss of the leaking coolant. Caleb didn't look up immediately. It took a massive, concentrated effort just to lift his heavy head. When he finally forced his eyes open, he saw Tolan and Aris standing at the edge of the rubble pile. They had crawled out of the maintenance vent. They were completely unhurt, entirely pristine, their pale grey skin contrasting sharply with the horrific slaughterhouse that surrounded Caleb. They were staring at him with a mixture of absolute awe and profound, sickening revulsion. Caleb didn't look like a savior. He was covered chest to toe in dark, ammonia-scented blood. His pale skin was mottled with deep purple bruises and smeared with black dirt. His eyes, sunken and shadowed from exhaustion, held a dark, hollow emptiness that no Vesperer could possibly comprehend. Is it over?" Aris asked, his voice cracking. "Open the door," Caleb rasped. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, gravel-filled well. He pointed a trembling, blood-soaked finger at the heavy blast doors leading to the bridge. Tolan swallowed hard, stepping gingerly around the massive corpse of the commander. He didn't look at the dead alien. He kept his eyes locked on Caleb, terrified that the human might suddenly turn on him. Tolan reached the blast door and interfaced with a glowing console on the wall. He tapped a rapid sequence of chimes and clicks. The heavy doors hissed, unlocking with a deep, pneumatic groan, and slid apart. Caleb forced himself up. It wasn't graceful. It was a slow, agonizing haul, using a piece of the shattered planter to support his weight until his knees locked into place. Every movement felt like dragging heavy chains through thick mud. He limped through the doorway. The bridge of the Vespera vessel was massive, a sweeping hemisphere of pristine white curves, holographic displays, and wide observation windows looking out into the cold, indifferent blackness of the cosmos. Around 20, Vespera crew members were huddled in the center of the room, entirely unarmed, clutching datapads and weeping softly. When they saw Caleb, they recoiled as a single, terrified mass. They didn't see the man who had just saved their lives. They saw a monster, a brutal, bleeding relic from an era they had spent centuries trying to forget. An older Vespera wearing a slightly darker grey uniform tunic stepped forward, though his long legs trembled violently. "Commander Tolan," he said, his voice laced with panic. You unleashed it, the archaic asset." He secured the atrium overseer. Tolan said, defending his choice, but keeping a safe distance from Caleb. "The heavy shock troops have been neutralized." Caleb didn't care about their politics. He stumbled toward the primary tactical display, a massive holographic table in the center of the room. He leaned his heavy bleeding forearms on the pristine white surface, staining it instantly with dark streaks of alien gore. "Where is their ship?" Caleb demanded, looking at the overseer. The overseer blinked, horrified by the mess Caleb was making on the console. It remains attached to the port airlock on Deck 4. They are using an ablative umbilical tube. Caleb looked at the tactical display. A flashing red indicator showed the breach point. Another indicator blinking rapidly showed movement inside the umbilical. "They're sending more," Caleb muttered. He coughed a wet, ragged sound and spat a streak of blood onto the floor. The commander didn't check in. "They're sending a clean-up crew. We must surrender," the overseer cried, throwing his long hands up. "We can offer them the nav data. If we give them the coordinates, perhaps they will spare the crew." "They won't spare you," Caleb said, his voice dead and flat. "They're a parasitic, expansionist species. You said it yourself. They don't want your data to leave you alone. They want your data so they know where to find the rest of your defenseless planets. You give them the maps, you kill your whole species. Then what do we do?" Aris panicked, rushing to the table. "You cannot fight another cadre. Your physical structure is failing. Your heart rate is arrhythmic." "I don't have to fight them," Caleb said. He looked at Tolan. "The outer airlock doors in the central atrium. Can you open them from here?" Tolan froze. The translation matrix hummed silently for a long moment. "Open the outer doors." "To the vacuum of space, the atrium is compromised. The inner bulkheads are shattered. If I open the outer doors, the entire sector will decompress." "Do it," Caleb ordered. "It will vent the Arboretum," the overseer screamed, stepping forward, his obsidian eyes wide with horror. "The rare flora, the atmosphere, it will tear the docking umbilical apart." "The flora is dead," Caleb said, turning his heavy, bruised face toward the overseer. His eyes were cold, completely devoid of empathy. "The botanists are dead, and if you don't open that door in the next 30 seconds, you're going to be dead too. The umbilical is attached to Deck 4, which feeds directly into the atrium lift shafts. If you vent the atrium, you rip the umbilical off the hull. The vacuum will pull the boarding party out before they ever touch the deck." "It is barbaric," the overseer whispered, stepping back from the sheer, overwhelming presence of the human. "It is the destruction of our own sanctuary." "Welcome to war," Caleb growled. He slammed his bloodied hand down on the console, the sound echoing sharply across the silent bridge. "Open the damn door, Tolan. Now." Tolan didn't look at the overseer. He looked at Caleb. He saw the cold, brutal logic of a species that had survived an apocalypse by sacrificing whatever was necessary. With trembling fingers, Tolan entered his command override codes. "Warning." The ship's soft, synthetic voice chimed entirely too calm for the situation. "Catastrophic pressure loss detected in Sector 4. Engaging emergency bulkheads." Through the massive observation windows of the bridge, Caleb watched. He couldn't hear the sound of the decompression, but he felt the heavy thud reverberate through the ship's spine. Outside, in the cold blackness of space, a violent eruption of debris blasted outward from the side of the pristine white vessel. A massive cloud of freezing blue liquid shattered white stone, and glowing crystalline leaves spewed into the void, glittering like a sudden violent snowfall against the backdrop of the stars. And among the debris tumbling helplessly into the absolute zero of deep space were the heavy, black-armored shapes of the Scourge reinforcement cadre. They didn't have time to secure themselves. The violent depressurization ripped the ablative umbilical tube entirely off the Vespera hull, shredding the Scourge's boarding corridor like wet paper. The heavy drones spun away into the dark, their limbs flailing uselessly in the vacuum, shrinking to tiny black dots before disappearing entirely. The Scourge ship, realizing its boarding party had been vented and its tether severed abruptly, ignited its heavy chemical thrusters. It didn't retaliate. It didn't fire on the Vespera vessel. It simply turned and burned hard away from the sector, retreating into the void. Caleb watched the crude thruster flare fade into the distance. He didn't cheer. He didn't feel a surge of victory. He just felt an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion pulling him down into the floorboards. The adrenaline finally evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, agonizing reality of his ruined body. His knees buckled. He didn't try to catch himself. He simply let go, sliding down the side of the pristine white command console, leaving a wide streak of blood against the plastic until he hit the deck. He lay on his back, staring up at the curved, seamless ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful hitches. The universe was quiet again. The medical bay on Deck 2 was untouched by the violence. It was exactly like the room Caleb had woken up in, curved, sterile, and aggressively white. He sat on the edge of a floating diagnostic bed. Iris had spent the last 2 hours applying localized dermal regenerators to Caleb's myriad of cuts and lacerations. His ribs had been tightly bound in a rigid, synthetic brace that forced him to sit perfectly upright. He smelled strongly of the antiseptic gel they used to clean the dark alien blood from his skin. He was clean, but he looked terrifying. His body was a roadmap of violent history. The new raised red welts from the Scourge fight layered over the old faded white scars from the water wars of Earth. Tolan stood by the doorway. He hadn't spoken since the bridge. He just watched Caleb with a careful, cautious distance. "Your cellular repair rate is astounding," Iris murmured, stepping back and looking at a holographic readout. "You should have expired from shock 3 times over. Yet your core systems are stabilizing." Caleb didn't respond to the medical assessment. He stared at his own hands, opening and closing his thick fingers, feeling the stiffness in his joints. "What year is it?" Caleb asked. His voice was quieter now, the gravelly edge softened by pure fatigue. "By your calendar," Tolan said, stepping slightly into the room. "It is roughly the year 13,214. Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't process the number. It was just math. "Earth," Tolan hesitated. "A dead rock, stripped of atmosphere by a localized solar event 7,000 years ago. Your people, those who did not enter the deep crust stasis vaults, they perished. We only found your vault because of a deep penetrating geological scan." Caleb didn't cry. He didn't scream. The grief was too massive, too abstract to feel all at once. It would come later, he knew. It would come in the quiet moments between the fighting. It would come when he tried to remember the smell of rain hitting hot asphalt, or the sound of Sullivan laughing over a crackling radio, and found those memories fading. For now he just felt deeply, profoundly hollow. "You don't have cigarettes, do you?" Caleb asked, looking up at Tolan. The commander blinked, confused. "A combustible cylinder of dried toxic flora, inhaled for chemical stimulation." "Yeah, that. No, such things were eradicated millennia ago." Caleb let out a short, bitter laugh. It sounded like a cough. "Right. Because you guys evolved past all the messy stuff. You made the universe clean, soft." Tolan didn't bristle this time. He looked down at the pristine white floor, then back at Caleb. "We believed we had. We believed intelligence and empathy had conquered the base instincts of the galaxy. We were wrong. The Scourge proved that the universe does not care about our philosophy. The universe doesn't care about anything, Tolan," Caleb said softly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, ignoring the tight pull of the rib brace. "It just is. You can build all the beautiful gardens you want. You can pretend the teeth in the dark aren't real. But eventually something hungry always comes knocking. And that is why we need you," Tolan said. It wasn't a demand. It was a concession. It was the sound of a proud man admitting a terrible truth. The Coalition. We cannot change what we are. We cannot breed soldiers. We cannot teach our people to fight the way you fight. It is completely alien to our psychology. Caleb looked at his hands again. So I'm the designated attack dog. You are the shield, Aris interjected, his voice pleading. You saved us today, Caleb. You saved hundreds of lives on this vessel. We are eternally grateful. Grateful, Caleb repeated. He looked at Aris, then at Tolan. He saw the way they stood near the door. He saw the way they flinched when he shifted his weight. They weren't looking at a hero. They were looking at a loaded gun resting on a table. They were glad it was there to shoot the intruder, but they were terrified it might go off and hit them. He didn't blame them. He was a relic, a ghost from a brutal forgotten era, dredged up from the ice to do the butcher's work for a society too clean to get its hands dirty. He was the monster they kept in the basement, unleashed only when the other monsters came too close. How many ships do they have? Caleb asked. Tolan straightened up. The Scourge. Their fleet numbers in the thousands. They are currently blockading the outer rim of the Vespera sector. Caleb nodded. He pushed himself off the diagnostic bed. His bare feet touched the cold, sterile floor. His body ached. His soul was utterly exhausted. But there was nowhere else to go. The war on Earth was over, but the war never actually ended. It just changed coordinates. He looked at the two aliens, his face a mask of cynical, weary resolve. "Get me a bigger gun," Caleb said, walking toward the door. "And find me a damn pair of boots. If you enjoyed this descent into the gritty, brutal reality of humanity's ancient past, colliding with a fragile future, hit that like button. We've got more parts coming, where Caleb shows the galaxy exactly why his species had to be put on ice. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this HFY saga. Drop a comment below. What would be the first thing you'd do if you woke up 10,000 years in the future? Share this with a fellow sci-fi fan, and stay tuned